I once had a classroom of students, and we were going through this, and there were a couple students. They wouldn't have it. They were pushing back. No, this is wrong. Those slaves had no rights. I said, okay, then why was slavery wrong? If they had no rights, if a slave has no rights at all, no right to his own liberty or his own life, why is it wrong for me or someone else to treat that person like property? And these students sat there. You could almost see the smoke coming out of their ears because they realized, yeah, slavery is wrong precisely because the slave has these same rights. You can't take the rights away. You can violate them when you put a slave in shackles and whip them and make them do work they don't want to do. Oh, you're violating those rights, but you can't separate them. Jefferson was right when he said the hand of force may destroy both life and liberty, but you can't disjoin it. Wherever there's human life, there's a free human mind there.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of American Potential. You know, we had Dr. Tom Krannawitter on before, and this episode is part 2 with Dr. Krannawitter to finish the conversation we were having about the Declaration of Independence and how the principles that were laid out in it helped with the framework of the Constitution. Now, in our previous episode, we discussed why the British Crown started taxing the colonies and why the colonies weren't used for that type of tax and wanted to have representation so their voices could be heard. Now, when the Crown came back with its response to this request, it said you already are represented because you are subjects of the Crown. And that didn't sit well with the colonists. And the beginnings of a revolution were made. I want to welcome back Dr. Tom Krannawitter, who holds a PhD from the School of Politics and Economics at the Claremont Graduate University in California. He's also the founder of Speakeasy Ideas. Dr. Krannawitter, thanks again for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Jeff, very much. It's great to be here. By the way, I kind of want to jump off just on that, those introductory remarks you offered, because it's one of the great, I'm going to use a weird phrase here. It's one of the great philosophic political dramas in American history. You have these colonists in North America thinking through deep, profound questions of political philosophy, like the nature of rights. What are the most fundamental rights? Are they the rights of Englishmen, for example? That was one of the questions they raised. You know, we're English subjects, and there are these famous charters like Magna Carta and others that bestow certain rights and certain privileges on English subjects. And the question was, is that the most fundamental kind of rights one can have? And they're thinking through these philosophic questions that are worthy of the greatest minds, worthy of a Socrates or a Plato or an Aristotle, in the context of a high political drama, a great global empire saying to these colonists, "You're going to give us some money. We're going to tax you," right? And so that's going on as they're thinking through these questions. And what happens, and also we have records of all this. Pamphlets are wildly popular at the time, and even many newspapers will produce short philosophic treatises in them. And so we have these records, and what we find is the colonists in the period of the late 1760s, early 1770s, as you're getting closer to that, decisive moment in 1775 and 1776 when the actual revolution breaks out, the colonists exhaust all the remedies possible under the rights of Englishmen. And there's this decisive moment when they switch and they say, okay, if the rights of Englishmen, they're the traditional ancestral English rights, won't get us to where we need to go, which is full-blown representation. We don't want to be taxed without our consent. Then they reach for something deeper, something more profound, more fundamental, and they come across this idea of natural rights, God-given endowments, like the right to life, liberty, and property that belong not merely to Englishmen, but to every human being everywhere, throughout all of history, throughout all of time. These are ideas propounded by thinkers like John Locke, by Montesquieu, by others. And in that sense, the American revolutionaries reach for something that's philosophically more foundational than the traditional English rights or the doctrine of traditional English rights. And it becomes part of our founding, these universal rights that belong to all human beings. Americans say we too have them, and we want a government that protects our rights rather than our current government, the king, that's violating our rights.
Right. Yeah. So it was really a reframing from we get our rights from the British Crown to we get our rights from God. They're God-given rights, they're natural rights, and that was really the switch that you're talking about.
And let's clarify for our listeners. That might sound kind of insignificant or mundane at first glance, but the repercussions are revolutionary, because if your government is the creator of your rights, then in a decisive respect, your government can never be wrong, ever. Whatever rights you have or don't have, or whatever your government has decided to either give to you or take away or modify or redefine. But when you appeal to something above government, when you say our fundamental rights are their natural rights, they're God-given rights, now you have a standard by which to judge your own government. And you might conclude that your own government is wrong, is unjust, is unjustly violating these rights that God has given to you. And it really does create an environment where political revolution is possible in a way that I would argue, is really impossible within the context of traditional English thought.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Fascinating. How did Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison each contribute differently to creating the founding documents?
Well, let's take a stab here at first with the Declaration of Independence. In a way, this is the most fundamental document. It's the act of the Union. We know this in several ways. Scholars debate these things, and it's good to clarify these matters. When you look at the preamble of the Constitution, you remember famously, right? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And the Constitution lists 6 goals for establishing and ordaining the Constitution. And the final one is to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity and our children and grandchildren. Liberty, in the very first sentence of the Constitution, liberty is described as a blessing. And where do blessings come from? Blessings ultimately are gifts from God. That idea of that liberty, that freedom is a God-given natural right, is enshrined right there in the first sentence of the United States Constitution. In other words, the core idea of the Declaration of Independence is embedded in the Constitution. And then if you turn to the end of the Constitution, Article 7, it dates when the Constitutional Convention it concluded its work on September 17th of 1787. And it dates the United States. It says that they are in the independence of the United States, the 12th year. So if you think that through, in September 1787, the Constitution says they were into their 12th year of independence. And you count backwards, you end up with 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. So the Constitution quite literally begins and ends with appeals and acknowledgments of the Declaration of Independence. Half of the states, we have 50 states in the United States, except for Barack Obama, of course, who thinks we have 57, but the rest of us think there are 50. And more than half of our states entered the Union with what were called enabling acts. These were statutes passed by Congress authorizing the addition of a state into the Union. And those enabling acts said that a state constitution cannot violate the United States Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. There again, we see an acknowledgement of the Declaration as this foundational document, those ideas. Arguably the most famous speech in American history, maybe one of the most famous speeches in all of human history. Lincoln's little brief, the remarks he delivered at Gettysburg in 1863. You remember how he opened there, right? fourscore and 7 years ago. He's speaking in 1863, 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What's he referencing there? Well, 7 years ago was 1776. And what document famously declares, that all men are created equal, devoted to the proposition all men are created equal? That's the Declaration of Independence. So it really is the fundamental act of the Union. It's the document that presents the ideas, the principles that we're going to base this nation on and that we're going to aspire to. Even when we fall short, these are the principles by which we're going to judge ourselves. And the Continental Congress, so this is in the peak of the Revolutionary War. The fighting had been going on for more than a year. Fighting had started in April of 1775. This was the summer of 1776. So this is almost a year and a half later. And the Continental Congress creates a committee of 5 people to go write a document that formally declares that the United States not merely declares the United States to be independent from British rule, but also give reasons why, explain why the revolutionaries are right to make that claim. And that committee has Thomas Jefferson on it, John Adams is on it, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and Robert Livingston from New York. There's a great story we have to share with your listeners. John Adams goes to Jefferson and he says, Tom, you really need to write this document. And he gives him 2 reasons. He said, there are 2 reasons why you should write it and not me, not John Adams. Number one, you, Thomas Jefferson, at that time, he was relatively unknown, especially outside of Virginia. He was not well known, and therefore he did not have many political enemies and opponents in 1776. Adams had enemies and opponents. Adams was one of these guys. He could walk into a room with 10 people and walk out with 11 enemies. Like he was just crusty and cranky, and people did not like him. So we thought, okay, number one reason, you have fewer enemies than I have. Adams was worried that if he wrote the document, many people in the colonies would reject it just because it came from Adams. And he said, secondly, you're 10 times a better writer. And that's saying a lot, because Adams was no slouch when it came to writing and reading and being learned and erudite. Of course, I think he was trying to flatter Jefferson a little bit there, but it's true. Jefferson had this amazing capacity to articulate philosophic ideas in poetic terms that were memorable and moving.
Now, let me ask you a question. How did John Adams know this? How did he know that about Jefferson?
Well, there are several ways, but probably the most important way, a mere 2 years earlier, in 1774, same month, in the summer, June and July, Jefferson had penned a document that ended up being circulated throughout all the colonies. It was addressed to the King of England, and it was titled A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And it really is a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. All those charges against the king that you find in the Declaration, they were spelled out and expanded upon. The summary view of the rights of British America is a very long document. And so it gives all the details of all those injustices that the king had either done directly to the colonists or had authorized or had allowed to happen and had not intervened. And Jefferson, he thundered at the end of that document. Famously, he concluded, he said, the God that gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time, And while the hand of force may destroy both, it cannot disjoin them. You can't take it apart. As long as there's human life, there's a free being. There's a being there that can make its own choices and govern itself. That's what it means to be human. You can't separate human liberty from human life. That was Jefferson's argument in 1774. So when this committee of five, right, these are all talented, smart people on the committee. Ben Franklin, by that time, was one of the most famous scientists in the world. The whole world knew about Ben Franklin. And they all agreed this relatively quiet, kind of meek little man from Virginia, Tom Jefferson, he really should write the draft. And he agrees. He does write it. He spends the last 2 weeks in June writing out the draft of the Declaration. The very first thing he does with it is he shares it with his other committee members, Adams and Franklin and Sherman and Livingston. And both Adams and Franklin make a few edits. And the edits are really interesting. Franklin in particular, he looked at that famous second line. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But that's not what Jefferson had written. Jefferson, in his original draft, wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And Franklin, you can still see this in the original draft. He scratched out the word sacred and the word undeniable, and he wrote in above self-evident. And there's an important reason for this. Franklin was right to do this. Franklin was concerned if you present a truth as sacred, well, that sounds very close to an article of religious faith. And remember what had been going on in Europe for centuries prior to the American Revolution, wars of religion. Christians were butchering each other, Catholics and Protestants, and sometimes they were going after Jews. I mean, it was an ugly affair. And these revolutionaries in North America, they wanted to create a regime of religious liberty. They did not want a theocracy that could engage in direct religious persecution. So he scratches out the word sacred. And then to say that a truth is undeniable, I think Ben Franklin was wise enough to realize that's kind of silly. Anyone can deny anything. I mean, they might be wrong, but Jeff, I could go crawl up on the roof right now and I could say, I deny gravity. I deny that gravity exists. And I'm going to demonstrate that I can just fly. There is no gravity. And I could jump off the roof. Now, immediately, of course, we all know what's going to happen. Gravity's going to assert itself and I'm going to fall to the ground. But the point is, even something as simple like gravity, it can be denied. And so Franklin saw no value in asserting that something is undeniable. There will be people who deny it. King George III denies human equality. Instead, he inserts this term of philosophic art, self-evident, a self-evident truth. This is a concept that stretches all the way back to the logical treatises of Aristotle. This is a philosophic concept that had been discussed at length by Thomas Aquinas in two of his books. A self-evident truth is a truth, a true proposition, the evidence for which is contained in the terms of the proposition. That means it's not obvious. It's not undeniable. It means there's a proposition, like all men are created equal, and the evidence is in the terms. You have to understand when it says all men, what does that mean? What are human beings? Man as in mankind. What is mankind? What separates mankind from non-mankind, from other kinds of animals? And it turns out the answer is, well, every human being, whether they're tall or short or pretty or ugly or smart or stupid, they all have a free mind. Every human being has a free mind. Every human being has the capacity to make his own choices, to govern himself. And in that respect, all men are created equal. Every human being has this equal ability to make choices for himself. And that's why Franklin makes that correction. And it was good that he did. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They're not obvious. They're not undeniable. They're not sacred. They're self-evident. When you understand how human beings are different from non-human beings, you understand they are all equal. in this way, that they all have a free mind. The Declaration goes on to say that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That too is true. Every human being. Doesn't matter where they're born. Doesn't matter when they're born. Doesn't matter what language they speak or what skin color they have or what food or music preferences they have. Every human being has a rightful claim to his or her own life, liberty, and the freedom to go try to be happy, to pursue happiness. The Declaration, it does two things simultaneously, so it makes it brilliant and beautiful. It presents these philosophic and moral truths, and it gives us a goal at which to aim. If everyone has these unalienable rights, these equal rights, then we should aim to protect them, not violate them. We should acknowledge them. We should respect the rights of others. Also, I want to mention very quickly that term unalienable. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable means they cannot be taken away. And this is a difficult concept for many Americans today to understand. They'll look back and they'll say, well, there were Americans at that day whose rights were being violated. In some places, women weren't voting. They didn't have any rights. Slaves were treated as property. They didn't have any rights. And here's the truth. Slavery was wrong at that time. It was wrong. It was morally wrong, precisely because those slaves, every one of them, did indeed possess the same unalienable rights to their own life, their own liberty, their own pursuit of happiness. I once had a classroom of students that we were going through this, and there were a couple of students. They wouldn't have this. They were pushing back. No, this is wrong. Those slaves had no rights. I said, okay, then why was slavery wrong? If they had no rights, if a slave has no rights at all, no right to his own liberty or his own life, why is it wrong for me or someone else to treat that person like property, to treat that person like hamburger? Why is that wrong? And these students sat there. You could almost see the smoke coming out of their ears because they realized, yeah, slavery is wrong precisely because the slave has these same rights. You can't take the rights away. You can violate them when you put a slave in shackles and whip him and make him do work they don't want to do. Oh, you're violating those rights, but you can't separate them. Jefferson was right when he said the hand of force may destroy both life and liberty, but you can't disjoin them. You can't, the hand of force, even a cruel, slave driver with a whip or chain, you can't separate human life from human liberty. There's still wherever there's human life, there's a free human mind there.
Yeah. And this was the first time really in human history that had been recognized through this Declaration of Independence, right?
It first time ever that this had been there were a handful of philosophic minds who would write relatively obscure, treatises and philosophic tracts who had acknowledged this. John Locke had acknowledged this. Adam Smith had acknowledged this. Montesquieu had acknowledged this idea. But never before had a group of people, a large number of people, embrace this idea as the foundation for their particular regime, their sovereign political regime. It's this amazing combination of taking an idea that applies to everyone. It's not merely Americans who have these God-given endowments, these natural rights. It's all human beings have it. And the Americans are saying, so we're going to create a government here, a political regime, for one purpose, to protect and secure our natural rights. Everyone else has the same natural rights. People in Africa have the same natural rights. People in Asia have the same natural rights. People all over the world, all throughout history have them. And we wish them good luck they should go create a regime that protects their rights. They should consider if they live under some miserable tyranny that's violating their rights, we hope they consider revolution and instituting a new form of government that will protect their rights. But for we Americans, the purpose of our government is going to be to secure our rights, not to secure the rights of everyone else in the world. That understanding of a universal principle that applies to all people, and then a practical application of it to one sovereign nation had never happened before in history. It happened here for the first time, and it's one of the most amazing, beautiful, sometimes I think it was miraculous because of all the elements and minds and personalities that came together to make the American Revolution and the American founding happen.
Yeah. As you talk about this, I think people look at the founding documents almost as one and the same, or one and then immediately followed the next, right? The Declaration, then came the Constitution. But it took a number of years for that to happen. Talk about how the Declaration of Independence helped shape the outline for the Constitution, and what was it like during that period between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution actually, being adopted?
Well, it's great for modern Americans to remember that what we call our Constitution is, to use some modern lingo, it's actually the Constitution V2. It's the second version. We had an earlier Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. That also points to the possibility. I'm not encouraging this here. I just want to remind Americans, we had the rightful authority, we had the natural right to adopt the Articles of Confederation as what we thought was a wise and good form of government at that time. And after about a decade, we decided it's not doing this. It's not actually protecting rights. And so we adopt a new constitution, and something really decisive happens. The moment the Americans ratify the new United States Constitution of 1787, the entire government that was sitting under the old Articles of Confederation, that's no longer valid. It is delegitimized instantly the moment the Americans ratify a new constitution. And that suggests to us today, as thoughtful, active citizens, could we have a natural right to adopt a third constitution? If we thought that was necessary and wise and good, would we have the natural right? And the answer is, yeah, we would. And so we should really take these matters seriously. We should think and talk openly with each other. Does our Constitution that we have, that was written in 1787, is it protecting our rights? Or has it been perverted to such a degree that it's really protecting a privileged elite class more than it is ordinary citizens? That's a conversation to have. And I'm not saying we should go adopt a third constitution, but if we wanted to, if we needed to, if it was necessary for justice and the securing of equal rights, then we definitely have that natural right to do so. That's how we get the Constitution. Is our first experiment in self-government didn't go very well. There were all kinds of fights going on. People were defaulting they would sign contracts. This is under the Articles of Confederation. And then they would default on the contract. They wouldn't pay their debts. And when judges would sit, lawsuits would be filed. The people who were owed money would say, look, we want to take, what this person has as collateral, their farm or their house. And before the judge could reach a verdict in the case, you had angry farmers with guns storming courthouses and chasing the judge out into the street. It was a total breakdown in the rule of law. We were not under the Articles of Confederation. We were not prepared to defend Americans against foreign threats had they come. Had there been a concerted, directed foreign attack on the new United States, we would have been sitting ducks. And this is why we hold a constitutional convention. We draft a new constitution. It's meant to provide for a government that, on the one hand, is energetic when you need it to be energetic, especially in times of war, in times of foreign, danger, foreign threats and attacks. A government that can respond quickly to that. And during peace times, it provides for a national government that for the most part should be fairly quiet, shouldn't be doing very much. And most of the governing and political activity is reserved to state and local communities during times of peace. If you read the Federalist Papers, for example, in number 45, Madison argues at length. He said, this is why under this Constitution, Americans have a huge incentive to be at peace. There's a big disincentive about going to war, and that is when you go to war, the national government gets really busy, and it needs to build up its army and its navy, and it might start calling for all kinds of resources to go prosecute the war effort successfully. And if we need to do that, Madison's point was, we will, of course, but it would be better to minimize that. We don't want to be at war all the time, because when we're not at war, most of the power and most of the activity will be at the state and local levels, where ordinary citizens have more direct control over those levels of government. And then you turn to the Bill of Rights, and for the first time I noticed this, it almost knocked my socks off, Jeff. It's so amazing. When you read through the list of grievances against the king in the Declaration of Independence, and things like the king is quartering troops, he's sending his troops over to North America, and you, the ordinary citizen, are duty bound as an English subject. You have to house these troops. They're sleeping in your house. You have to feed them. You have to offer medical care when they're wounded or sick. It was this giant burden imposed on the colonists. That is one of the grievances in the Declaration. And then you turn to the Bill of Rights, and what do you find? Why, you find the Constitution prohibits the quartering of troops. All through the Bill of Rights, it tracks the grievances listed out in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration is almost like the blueprint for the form and the substance that the Bill of Rights ends up taking in the Constitution. So there's a very direct connection between the structure and the purpose of the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. Last episode, we discussed how some of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery, but they got criticized for owning slaves. Talk about that. Talk about how, at least in the state of Virginia, the state made it almost impossible to let owners free their slaves, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, look, let's be really, with the outfits like the 1619 Project spreading lies all over the place, we have to be very, very careful in our language. The British colony of Virginia made it virtually impossible to free slaves so of course, Virginia initially is, it is a British colony. It's chartered by the king. The king would offer these charters, which really we throw that word around all the time. It's a permission slip, because let's say you were an Englishman, Jeff, in the 16th century, and you wanted to go exploring. You wanted to get on a ship and go sail to other continents. You weren't allowed to do that. As a subject, you had to go beg permission. And chances are, if you weren't somehow connected to the king, if you didn't have some personal, political, your family connect something, you wouldn't be granted the permission. Once in a while, a few they were granted charters, which were just permission slips. You now have the permission of the king to go sail off and explore some new lands. That's how Virginia came to be. It was a British colony, which means it was subject ultimately to all laws that Parliament passed. It was governed by royal edicts. Any kind of edict that the King of England issued directly ruled the people in Virginia. Now, they were given permission to form some of their own local legislation involving local matters, all subject to revision by both Parliament and the king. And that was what the House of Burgess was. The House of Burgess was the little local colonial legislature dealing with local matters in Virginia. And the House of Burgess, of which Thomas Jefferson was part, he'd been elected to it, they attempted multiple measures, including limiting the number of slaves imported into Virginia from Africa, from the Atlantic slave trade, vetoed by the King of England. They tried to set a sunset clause, a time when slavery would no longer be allowed in Virginia, vetoed by the King of England, because the King of England was doing things like he was chartering slave trading companies, British companies that would invest capital in ships and then go pick up slaves in Africa and sail them across the Atlantic Ocean to North America and South America and the Caribbean and all kinds of other destinations. So the king is protecting his crony friends and the mutual investments they've made that they're getting rich off of, and they won't allow Virginia, the colony, to stop slavery. Now, after the Revolution, the king no longer can veto anything. This is the Virginia and the United States in general. It is an independent sovereign nation. And what happens is one of the greatest tragic dramas in all of history. These new sovereign free people, the Americans, they take their founding ideas very seriously, and they're talking about it. They're writing about it. And as they think it through, they realize why the very reason that monarchy is wrong, governing us without our consent, is the same reason why slavery is wrong. We call it two different things, but in principle, it's the same. In both cases, it's a human being ruling over someone else without their permission, without their consent. That's wrong. It's one person violating the rights of someone else simply by force, by being physically stronger, whether it's a slave driver with a chain or it's a king with an army and a navy. In either case, it's just brute force. And this ignites in the new states the greatest anti-slavery movement ever. And when modern Americans today say, oh, well, those founders were terrible, some of them had slaves, I say, no, they weren't terrible. This is what makes it amazing. This is what makes it beautiful. Yes, some of them did have slaves, as had most people throughout, or many people throughout all of human history, with this exception. The slave owners, many slave owners in the new United States, come to understand that slavery is wrong. And many of them manumit or free their own slaves. And even more, it starts a political movement, not merely to individuals free slaves, but to abolish slavery legally. And that movement, it's like a fuse gets lit, and it burns so hot and so fast that within 2 generations after the founding, the Americans fight a horrific civil war. They end slavery, first by way of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but they do it finally, constitutionally, decisively with the 13th Amendment. And that's less than a century. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. 1865 is the 13th Amendment. Less than a century. There had never been an abolition movement to abolish slavery that was so decisive, so expeditious, so fast as what happened in the United States. And that happened because human beings born into a very imperfect world, imperfect human beings born into an imperfect world. That's what the Americans were. They were ordinary people. They weren't really anything special. They had a few among them who were unusually learned and well-read, but it's a nation of farmers and shopkeepers and fishermen, and just like you would find anywhere else in the world. But these people in North America declared their independence on this principle of human equality. And as they thought that through, they realized, wow, this institution that's been around forever, slavery, it's deeply wrong. It's deeply unjust, deeply immoral. We got to get rid of it. And I say, thank God they did. What a wonderful, beautiful story. I call it a tragedy because it ends up costing terrible, terrible amounts of blood and death and money and destruction. The Civil War is brutally horrific. It's cruel. But that's what the Americans did in order to live up to their own good principles. And in that sense, that is a tragedy worthy of the greatest tragic poets and storytellers.
Yeah. And, as you think about it, and we'll never know the answer to this because you can't know the unknown, but what kind of world would we live in today had it not been for our founders who set out on that course, as you talked about, even in the House of Burgess, trying to eliminate the slave trade, working to do that, except it was vetoed by the king. But if they hadn't pushed forward and hadn't, declared independence and then founded this new government, where would the world be today?
It's a fascinating question. It's one, it's so easy for us, right? We sit here in our comfortable houses with our computers, right? And our air conditioning and all the luxuries that we have today, and the semblance of freedom that we still have. People have been trying to take our way of freedom, and they have taken away a lot of it, but not all of it. We still have some freedom left. And it's so easy to take everything that we have for granted. And yet, we forget the rule of monarchs and Caesars and pharaohs, and they came up with all kinds of exotic titles to give themselves. But that was the norm, not merely for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. And then there's this moment in time in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, where in very short order, the idea of a king becomes laughable to people all around the world. It just becomes ridiculous. And you have to have, what role do the Americans have in that cultural transformation around the world? A lot. I don't know exactly how you measure that, but the whole world is watching this American Revolution. And we know this because later revolutionaries will cite the American example. The French would cite the American example. Even the Russians, the Bolsheviks, would cite the American example. So we're influencing and inspiring revolutionaries around the world. And while say the Russian revolutionaries differ greatly from the French revolutionaries, and they all differ from the American revolutionaries, they did have this in common. None of them would tolerate a king. None of them. Like, this is so stupid. This is so ridiculous that just because someone has a crown on his head and wears, some regal purple cape, that he gets to lord over us without our, no, we reject this. I don't think that decisive turn against kingship and monarchy and the rule without consent, that doesn't happen as fast as it does. Maybe it doesn't happen at all without the influence of the Americans.
Yeah. You talked about this comparison between the slavery and citizens being able or individuals not being ruled over by a king. Are there examples of that comparison that we can examine? Because that's not what you hear from many people in America today. They don't want to acknowledge that America set out, or our founders set out, to abolish slavery. Are there examples of that comparison in the writings of our founders?
Oh, they talked about it at length. I cite in my book on Lincoln, it's titled Vindicating Lincoln. I have a whole section in there where my argument is that Lincoln doesn't transform the founding. He doesn't reject it. He doesn't overturn it. Lincoln continues it. That he saw that the American founding in a decisive respect was incomplete. The principles were right, but in practice, we didn't live up. Our policies and practices didn't live up to the principles. And he wants to improve and elevate our policies and practice, including our Constitution. So Lincoln thinks of himself as continuing the founding, completing the founding, the project set out by Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and all the others. And in the founding, what you find is example after example after example, multiplied by dozens, multiplied by hundreds. Every one of the leading influential minds during the American founding, so you name it, Northerners, Southerners, it doesn't matter. George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, to Thomas Jefferson, all of them addressed slavery. None of them ignored it. And every single one of them denounced it as a great injustice. And the only debatable thing about slavery was a question of prudence. What's the wise thing to do? Should we try to abolish it instantly? You know, a lot of people had deep vested interest in slavery and they weren't just going to give it up. Or should we work incrementally over a generation or two or three to try to slowly get rid of it? Those were the debates. By what means should we get rid of slavery? But they all agreed we got to get rid of it. Even Jefferson. Jefferson's interesting. Jefferson was very much a man of the Enlightenment science. He thought you can only really believe firmly something that's been demonstrated, something for which there is observable evidence. And he raised questions. An example is his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. He raised questions whether Black people or people with African descent with black skin, whether they have the same intelligence and talents, mental talents, intellectual talents as white people and other people. And his conclusion is, he says, I don't know. You really have to do a lot of, you'd have to have, experiments where people with black skin are raised in the exact same environments, right? And the people with other skin, and see how they turned out and how intelligent they were and how gifted they were. But he would always qualify this and say, regardless, I don't know for sure if all these different groups of people are the same intelligence or not. Regardless, they all have the same natural right to govern themselves. All of them, every human being has the same natural right to his own life, his own property, his own liberty, the freedom to pursue happiness. So even Jefferson, who raised questions about black people, it's there. It's not very pleasant to read, but it's right there in the literature. Even he says, we do have to get rid of slavery. We can't keep doing this. This is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. I think Jefferson looked at this from his point of view. We have to remember slavery was only one of the great challenges during the American founding. First they had to win an actual war against the British, which was no small thing at all. We barely won by the skin of our teeth, and we wouldn't have won without the help of the French. And then we had to create a self-governing constitutional republic. We needed to abolish monarchy and titles of nobility. We needed to secure property rights within the laws. We needed to create a regime of religious liberty so that Protestants and Catholics aren't shooting each other in the streets and they're not persecuting Jews, right? All the kind of stuff that was happening in Europe. Jefferson helped accomplish all those things. And I think he looked at slavery and said, yep, this is another problem we got to solve. This for the next generation. We did all this. We launched independence. We won the Revolutionary War. We created a constitutional republic of religious liberty. Next generation, you guys take on that problem of slavery. Good luck. It's going to be really thorny and ugly. And he was right. It was really thorny and ugly.
Right. Final question. How's the Declaration of Independence impacted other nations and other independence movements around the world?
Not nearly as much as I wish it would have. Probably the most direct influence would be the French Revolution. The problem with the French Revolution, the American revolutionaries were, this phrase gets overused so much, but I really do mean this. They were a special group. They understood the principle of revolution. I'm talking about the Americans here. the Jeffersons and the Hamiltons and Ben Franklin and all the rest, John Adams. They understood revolution in principle. They understood why their revolution was just and right, why self-government is morally superior to tyranny without the consent of the governed. And simultaneously, they had tremendous value for prudence, for being cautious and careful. They looked at revolution as this terrifying alternative that should be avoided if there was any way to avoid it and still get justice. They knew that revolution is this like terrible genie that once you let it out of once a whole nation of people, right? Revolution isn't merely a few guys going off half-cocked with guns. That's not a revolution. A revolution is many people within a nation saying, we will no longer obey the laws. We will no longer respect the authority of the government at all. None of it. If they send cops after us, we'll shoot the cops. We don't respect the courts. No. That can become really dangerous. And so the Americans are cautious about that. And what makes Americans really interesting is they follow their revolution instantly with a founding. There's a constitution, right? They adopt the Articles of Confederation. Immediately, once they kick the British out, they want to restore law and order because they realize these things are important. The French are almost drunk with enthusiasm for revolution. Can't wait to engage in revolutionary violence. And the French do let that genie out of the bottle. And once large numbers of revolutionaries in France refuse to obey the laws, refuse to acknowledge any kind of authority at all, they find it's impossible for them to bring their revolution to a stop. They can't. Even leading revolutionaries there like Robespierre, who helps fuel the revolution, later he suggests, okay, right, we've cut the heads off of everybody. We've taken the whole royal family and killed them. We need to establish some kind of law here. And so immediately the revolutionaries turn on him, on Robespierre. You think you're going to be the next, king or authority? We'll cut your head off too. And the French Revolution unravels. It spirals out of control until eventually you get a military strongman, Napoleon, who crushes the revolution out of existence. When you get into later times, what makes the French Revolution the closest comparison is they did talk about many of the same ideas. They did talk about the idea of natural rights. They were staunchly atheistic. So the French didn't talk about God-given endowments, but they did talk about inherent natural rights that don't come from government. You get in later, more modern periods, and what you'll find, for example, in the United Nations, what's it called? The Declaration of Universal Human Rights, this mishmash. There are certain ideas that are in our Declaration of Independence, like individual liberty, right to one's own life. That's in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But then they add to it things like the right to health care and the right to a house and the right to a subsidized education. Those are also in there, which are things, these are entitlements. These are economic entitlements that come out of our New Deal and later socialist movements. Those weren't concepts in our Declaration of Independence. The founders never would have said, you have a right to make someone else pay for your health care. Right? They would have said, you have a right to your life and your liberty. And if you want to be productive and try to create some wealth, you're free to do that. But you don't have a right to something like a house or an education or healthcare that someone else has to provide. You have a right to try to improve your life and make these things or buy these things with your own wealth. Later political thought says, no, you're entitled. You're entitled to other people's wealth in the form of healthcare or housing or education or food. And that gets mixed in these international documents with individual natural rights. So most modern statements of rights end up being very, very confused. like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it says, you, Jeff, you have a right to your property and you have a right to subsidized healthcare. So apparently I don't have a right to my property because I got to give some of my property to subsidize your healthcare, according to the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, thank you for joining us again, Dr. Krannawitter. Speakeasy Ideas. Dr. Krannawitter, by the way, I meant to ask you before we leave, tell us about Speakeasy Ideas and how folks can find out a little more there.
Speakeasy is a business that I've been running for a number of years. It's through which I do a lot of public speaking and writing. I develop materials for schools, educational curriculum material. Also, right now, probably the best way for people to follow me, I've launched a new Substack. So if they go on Substack, you can search my name, Krannawitter. The title of it is Liberty Lyceum. And that's sort of the platform I'm using to publish my writings and also keep people updated on things that I do a lot of public speaking and events and things like, great podcasts like yours, Jeff. And that's how I let people know what's going on is through the Substack.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.